And we're live on Book Chat Live. And this week we have the amazing author and farmer, Lorna Sixsmith.
Well, I was a farmer and I was blogging,
Oh.
sharing life on the farm. And there was one particular day when I was sorting cattle with my husband, and there was a lot of shouting, etc. And swear words were exchanged. And I went home and I wrote a blog post entitled 10 Things Anyone Marrying a Farmer Should Know. And that went viral. And it gave me the idea for a book. And that was my first book, which we'll talk about later. But then I went to my first book. Then I did 3 humorous nonfiction books, then a memoir. And then this year I've published my first novel.
Okay. Well, shall we get onto the books then? Well, we've still got good connectivity. Right. The first book is Burial Rites by Hannah Kent. So why did you pick this book?
I absolutely loved this historical fiction. It's set in Iceland in 1829, and it follows the story of Agnes, who has been tried for murder, and she's been found guilty, and she's going to be executed in sort of 8 months' time. But because there were no prisons in Iceland at the time, she has to stay with her family. He's like a local councillor, and she's been allocated a priest to look after her and try and get her to forgive her sins, etc. And over the course of the novel, you are introduced to Hannah more and more as she reveals what actually happened. And you are rooting for her. You do not want this execution to take place. You're really rooting for her, particularly from the second half of the novel. Now, I love historical fiction, particularly historical fiction that doesn't have a happy ever after or isn't romantic. So if you're looking for a gritty historical fiction, this is one of the best. Hannah Kent is wonderful. 5 out of 5.
Okay. So why did you pick that as the first book on your list? I know you kind of said they were in no order, but was it just the first one that came to mind?
It's just always just one of my favourite books. I think it was published in 2016 and it was my book of the year that year. And it's still one of my favourite historical fiction. And I also, I want to write historical fiction in the future.
Okay.
So I think that also, I found it to be an inspiring novel. It's inspiring me for what I want to do in the future. So yeah, she's just a wonderful writer.
Okay, shall we go on to the next book then? Irish Farming Life, History and Heritage by Jonathan Bell and Mervyn Watson. So why did you pick this book?
Well, Irish, yeah, because I'm a farmer. It's non-fiction. But for anyone who's looking for an insight into farming, but the history and heritage of it, going back over the last couple of 100 years, this is really accessible and it's really interesting. They write about Irish rural society, and what I really liked about it is that they included both men and women, because what you often find is that farming is seen as a male profession. And they weren't negative at all in that, yes, they include some negative aspects of rural life. But in general, it's a very gentle look at farming, but yet it's very realistic. And it's illustrated throughout as well. It's a beautiful book.
Oh, okay. Sounds interesting. Shall we go on to the next book?
Okay.
Which is Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen.
Well, this is one of my old copies. I had to include an Austen. I love all 6 of them. But Pride and Prejudice is just my absolute favourite. It's one of those that I read probably once a year, or else I listen to it on audio. You know, who doesn't love a wholesome romance, and Lizzie Bennet and Mr. Darcy? But one of the things I love about Austen is her sense of irony. And it really comes through in this book, maybe more than any of the others, I'm not sure. There's so much humour in it. And of course, you know, many people will have seen the various adaptations. I have to admit that the 1995 one with Colin Firth is my favourite. But I had to put one classic. Well, I've put 2 classics in, I think. But yeah, Pride and Prejudice is definitely a firm favourite.
Yes, I had to watch the 1995 version quite a few times because my mum used to play it all the time when I was at home. So I know that quite well. Mr. Darcy jumping out of the lake or whatever. Well, not jumping out of the lake, but yeah.
Jumping in.
Jumping in, yeah.
I actually my daughter and I went to Lyme last year and we found Mr. Darcy's pond eventually, where it was filmed. Yeah. Yeah, beautiful building, beautiful grounds.
Yeah. I'm sure, actually, I remember somebody else saying about the book when they went to the lake. A lot of people just like going to that lake to look at it. Anyway, shall we go on to the next book?
Okay.
And that is The Running Grave, Cormoran Strike Book 7. I don't know why I put that down. By Robert
It's by
Galbraith.
Robert Galbraith, who everyone probably knows is J.K. Rowling. And
Yeah.
I'm not going to talk about her politics and stuff as such, but the the Cormoran Strike and Robin Ellicott series is just wonderful. All 7 books I've read, all 7 books I've listened to on audio. Robert Glenister is just the most wonderful narrator. But what
Yeah.
I particularly love about these is that they're not only a good crime story, and there's usually one very meaty crime to be solved, as well as a few other little subplot crimes as you go along. But what's also wonderful is the romance in it. You've got this very slow burn, will they, won't they? And it's been
Yeah.
carrying the whole way. This is book 7. I think she said there's going to be 9 books. I'm not sure. But, I'm waiting with bated breath for book number 8 to come out. This is almost 1,000 pages. But yet, yeah, it is quite a tome. And I think it's something like 34 hours if you listen to it on audio. So I've read it and I've listened to it twice. And if I had time, I would actually read it again because her description and it's just wonderful. In this particular book, Robin ends up going into a cult. So it's really interesting from that point of view as well.
Okay. And do you need to have read all the previous books in the series, or can you read that standalone?
Now, you can read this one as a standalone, but I think you'll enjoy it a lot more if you start at the beginning because of the developing relationship between the characters.
Yeah. Okay. But if they're all 1,000 pages too, then it could
Well,
be.
no, some of them are smaller. I think that's the biggest. That is the most lengthy.
On to the next book. It's quite a famous book, The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett.
Okay. The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This is one of my favourite childhood books. It's set in Yorkshire, and I think I've always had a romance about Yorkshire ever since I read it. And I was actually in London during the summer, and I went to see this as an outdoor play, and it was absolutely beautiful. It tells the story of Mary, who's a very forlorn, disagreeable child who's orphaned in India, and she's sent to Yorkshire to stay with her uncle. And she doesn't know that his child is there and that he is a cripple. And it just forms just a growing friendship between the two characters as they find each other. And the magic behind it, of course, is the secret garden. So it's perfect to read as a child, but it's also wonderfully nostalgic to read it as an adult. It's great for just sitting on a Sunday afternoon in front of the fire and indulging with a cup of tea and some cake.
Yeah, I vaguely remember there was a TV version of it I saw as a kid, I think.
And I'd imagine that the front cover of this is probably taken from, a still from it that was done probably in the 80s. I don't remember watching it. I don't remember ever seeing it.
I think it was like a kids' TV program.
Yeah.
So, anyway, shall we go on to the next book, which
Okay.
is by a very esteemed author, Would You Marry a Farmer? By Lorna Sixsmith, which is you, obviously.
Okay, the reason I chose this book of my 4 other books is because, yes, it's humorous, but for anybody who's interested in country life, it does give a good insight into what not just farming life is like, but also country life. My degree was in English and history, and I'm actually doing a master's in history at the moment. So what I've done in this book also is I have compared farming life in the past with farming life in the present. And what I discovered when researching this book is that women nowadays, or certainly in 2013 when I was writing it, lots of them actually did want to marry a farmer, believe it or not. But back in the 1940s, 50s and 60s, farmers weren't a good catch. So I kind of make it humorous comparing as to what farmers were like then and what makes a farmer seen as a good catch in the 21st century.
Yeah, well, I mean, I suppose in Ireland you're still in the EU, so I'm not. That probably affects the farming in either a positive or negative way, I guess, compared to people. Maybe they're not such a good catch in the UK anymore. I don't know. So anyway,
Well, I
before we
think the
get too
last couple of
political,
years have been tough on all
yeah,
farmers, whether they're in Ireland or
yeah.
in the UK, to be honest.
Anyway, before we get political in the farming world, we'll go to
Yeah,
the
don't
next
mention
book.
Brexit.
Tess of the D'Urbervilles by Tom Hardy, which I was surprised hasn't been mentioned on this show before. So why this
Okay.
classic book, he says.
Well, it's my favourite of all of Hardy's novels. I did cry the first time I read. I think the first time I read it, I was about 17 or 18, and I did cry. But again, of course, it has that farming background, and Tess is working as a milkmaid and what have you. So I suppose that drew me to it as well. Myself coming from a farming background. But yeah, between the sexual double standards, the two male characters, the ending is just one of the most compelling novels. A lot of Hardy's novels do tend to be quite depressing,
Yeah.
but this one, the character just stayed with me. I didn't want, with some of his other novels, I almost, like Jude the Obscure, I almost wanted to forget about them after reading them. But
Oh,
Tess
okay.
has always stayed with me. I think she always will. And if I had time, I'd reread it, to be honest. It's a beautiful book, beautiful story.
Yeah, Jude the Obscure is the one that somebody else recommended. Actually, funny
Oh, I
enough.
know. It's just too depressing for me.
Yeah, I remember I had a little spell in my, I think it was my, maybe my 20s or 30s, where I was going through reading a lot of classic books because I felt I hadn't read them. And I remember reading this and A, thinking it was really depressing, but B, really thinking it was a really good book. So
Mm.
I probably agree with you. Well, something like Wuthering Heights, I was like, I don't understand why people like that. But
Oh,
this
I
is
do
just,
like Wuthering
yeah.
Heights.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah, but
I
I
like
suspect
Wuthering
that's
Heights as
more
well.
kind of,
Yeah.
you have to like the romance in it. Well, this is just a
Yeah.
generally well written,
Yeah. And the
really
threatening
good book.
nature of Heathcliff. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, shall we get on to another book? And Longbourn by Joe Baker. So,
So, Longbourn by Joe Baker. This, if you like, I suppose it could be a companion to Pride of Prejudice. It tells the housemaid, the below the stairs version of Pride and Prejudice. And so when you're reading it, you're sort of comparing it to what was happening in Pride and Prejudice, because it actually
yeah,
goes through the whole novel, but it's showing it from the, what was that program that used to be on years ago, Upstairs Downstairs.
yeah,
So it's a little bit like that, in that it shows the story from Sarah, a maid's perspective. And this isn't a spoiler because it's revealed quite early, but there is a manservant that comes to the Pride and Prejudice household, to the Bennett household, and he is related to the family, but he's there as a manservant, and that's quite interesting. At one point in the novel, when Elizabeth goes to stay with Charlotte, you kind of wonder how are they going to incorporate that in Longbourn? But actually, the writer does it quite well, and because Charlotte is short of maids, Elizabeth gets to bring Sarah with her. Sarah's with Elizabeth, if you like, for the
yeah.
entire novel. So you see the below stairs perspective, and there is some humour in it as well.
Yeah, I always like those kind of stories where there's a different story, but they're kind of they're writing the
Hmm.
story around the side. I like that kind of book as well.
It's just a different
Very,
perspective on everything.
yeah.
And it reveals just how hard the housemaids and servants had to work, really.
Oh yeah, yeah. Very different world. Anyway, let's go on to the next one. Amongst Women by John McGahern. Oh, sorry, pronounce. What? Sorry, John.
To John McGahern. I actually reread this on Sunday after
Yeah,
putting it on the list, and I thought, oh, it's such a short book. I'll get that read in an
yeah.
afternoon. I think it was about 30 years since I'd last read it, or close to it, or
Oh,
could be certainly 30 years since I bought it. It tells the story of a man called, oh goodness, Moran, and he's very much a patriarch within his family. He has three daughters and two sons, and his wife has died. And we enter the novel when one son has left home and he's gone to England. This is set in Ireland.
yeah,
And he is as Moran gets older and he becomes more feeble, he does marry again, but the language in the novel is absolutely beautiful. I mean, some of the descriptions are almost breathtakingly beautiful, but the cruelty that's there because he is such a misogynist and such a patriarch.
Yeah.
And the three daughters and his wife they're all either in a state of joy because he's in a good mood, or they're absolutely terrified and anxious, waiting for the next explosion from him. So you've got that contrast between the beauty of the language and the terror and anxiety that's almost palpable. And I just think that if you look back to what could happen nowadays as well, but certainly, 1950s and before and
Yeah.
1970s, it's probably quite a common situation in many farming households. And of course, he was under pressure as well because he was a farmer, but he wasn't actually making that much money.
Yeah.
So he was under financial pressure and he sort of wanted to act the big man amongst the neighbours, but he wasn't able to anymore. So he was trying to act the big man within his own household.
Yeah.
It's you read it in 2 hours. It's a beautiful book. Yeah. Another one to sit by the fire on a Sunday with.
I've noticed a slight theme for more depressing books you like reading.
I do. I'll be honest now. I've written a romantic comedy, which we'll come to, but I don't tend to read that genre that much. I actually do quite gritty books, and I love a book that's got an open ending at the end when you're sort of left to decide, "Ooh, what way does that go?" Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, it's like that's the thing. You learn the books you like when you read them, don't you? You don't have to be just like light unicorns jumping around. It can be miserable stuff if you want to. Right, on to the next book, which is Harvesting by Lisa Harding.
Yeah, I'm afraid it's another kind of depressing book, to be honest.
No, we don't embrace the depression. That's the thing.
Lisa Harding is a brilliant writer. I think this was her second novel, but it tells the story of young women who were trafficked into Ireland. So it is very grim. Yeah, it is very grim. It is not graphic at all. There are no graphic descriptions whatsoever. It's all in your imagination. And the power of her writing means that you're almost scared to turn the next page. The girls are very young, and some of the clients are not young at all. But I just think, there's been a lot in the media lately about more funding for women's refuges required. We've got that court case that's happening in France. And, this is an engaging and really compelling fictional work, but unfortunately, it's quite reflective of what's happening in society. And for that reason, I just think it's the kind of book that everyone should read. It's actually been made into a film. I don't know when it's coming out. I meant to check, but it is being made into a film. And again, the film isn't going to be graphic at all either. It's a closed door and it's left to your imagination.
Yeah. So I think we're going to go on to... We have rattled through the books pretty quickly, mainly because I've been worried to ask questions because of your ropey network connection. It's like... Shall we go on to the next book, which I'm not sure you'll like because it's kind of a bit happy, but it's Country Girl at Heart by Lorna Sixsmith. I don't know if she is. It's like some sort of happy-go-lucky writer.
Yeah, I think I might be. All of my books have been humorous, actually. Yeah, maybe I just read grim stuff and I write happy stuff, but I will be writing grim stuff eventually. Yeah, this is a romantic comedy. It's a little bit like Bridget Jones on the Farm, I suppose, in that. Yeah, Kelly leaves London with a broken heart and leaving a bad relationship, and she travels to her aunt's farm in rural Ireland, where she used to spend she spent a few childhood summers there, and she's got a maternity leave teaching contract, and she's determined to stay just for 5 or 6 months, and for as long as the contract, and then go abroad to Australia or Dubai. The world's her oyster.
Yeah,
but she meets a local accountant. And there's also neighbouring farmer Steve who helps her out. Her uncle has to go into hospital, and her aunt goes as well. So she is left having to look after the hobby farm, and things happen. For example, goats escape. Another goat goes into labour and she has to get help. She ends up helping her neighbour, different things. She loses her wellies when trying to rescue a sheep. There are quite, and I'll be honest, some of these were inspired, some of the events in this were inspired by things that happened to me,
Yeah.
so there is real farming in it, but it's very much with a comedic edge to it.
I thought you were going to say, and in the last chapter, a gunman comes in and shoots all the characters at the end.
No, this is going to be a series, so they're all very much going to stay
Okay,
alive.
sure. So that's what you're building up to.
And there is a happy ever after. So for anybody who likes happy ever after endings, there is a happy
I've
ending.
had this discussion with romance authors before. It's like almost you have to have a happy ever after, because it's not. Yeah, or if you do have romance and it's not happy out, it has to go in another category. It can't go in romance. So.
Yeah. And the dog cannot die either when it comes to romance. The dog cannot die. No. The dog is going to live forever.
So I ask everybody, well, I don't ask everybody 2 questions, but I ask authors 2 questions. The first one is, if you met somebody and you had to pick one of these books to give to them, what would be your decision-making process in working out? What kind of questions would you ask them to work out which book to give them? Or would there just be one book you would give them? Like, what's the flow chart in your mind? How would you work out which book to give them from this list?
I suppose the first thing I would ask if they like happy endings or not.
Yeah.
And if they don't, if they like a gritty, I would give them Burial Rites by Hannah Kent.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Yeah, I would. I just think that's a wonderful book. And if they do like happy endings, well, I'd have to give them Country Girl at Heart, wouldn't I?
Yeah. Well, you got a 50-50 chance giving them one of your books, then. You need
true.
to write your own grim, miserable, non-happy
That's
ending.
That's coming.
Yeah. Well, which comes on to the second question I ask authors, which is, what books have you got coming? Have you got a book that you feel you're going to write at some point in the future, but you haven't quite got the courage to write it yet? And and also, I think you've written other books that aren't on this list, so talk a little bit about them as well.
Okay, well, I'll talk about the books that I wrote then, first of all. The first one in that trilogy was Would You Marry a Farmer? And then I wrote another funny one, How to Be a Perfect Farm Wife, which is it gives realistic but funny tips to women who have come from a non-farming background and have married a farmer. And they're in this life, which is a very different culture to what they have come from. And it's like a different world. And then I thought, well, I can't leave the man out. And, some people might be thinking, oh, Lorna, you're being a bit sexist here. But, it's most farmers are male. 13% of land is registered with women. So for the purpose of those 3 books, I did act as if the farmer was male and the farm spouse was female. After that, I wrote Till the Cows Come Home, which was a farming memoir, which looks back over 3 generations on this farm. My generation, obviously, my father's and my grandfather's. And it explores how some things stayed the same over 3 generations and how some things obviously changed. And then I decided to write Country Girl at Heart. I do plan to make that into a series of probably 4 to 5 books. And the reason behind that is not just the development of the character arc or the character story. It's also because there has been such change in farming.
Yeah.
I set that book in 2017. Was Britain still in the EU then? No, Brexit had happened, hadn't it? But milk quotas, it was moving out of it. But milk quotas in the EU had been lifted in 2015. And that meant that dairy farmers for the first time could expand hugely if they wanted to. And a lot of other farmers, like sheep farmers, beef farmers, suckler farmers, tillage farmers, could go into dairy. So there has been huge change within the farming world across the EU, but particularly in Ireland. And things have started to slow down now and things aren't looking quite so rosy. So
Yeah.
I want to sort of catalogue that within the book. So although it's funny and it's romantic, it's sort of going to show historical change. People look back on it, hopefully, to show historical change. One book that I do want to write, and I've just started an MA in regional history to sort of equip
Yeah.
me with the skills to be able to write it, is that there was a woman that lived about not even 500 yards from where I'm living now, who in 1903 was hanged for her part in a murder of her husband.
Oh, okay.
And yeah, she was having an affair with another gentleman who actually lived in one of our fields and is still called Taylor's after his family. The two of them were hanged in 1903. But what was interesting at the time was that in England, 4 other women were accused and tried for similar crimes. And while they each got prison, none of them were hanged, where our Mary
Yeah.
Daly was hanged. And I just want to explore that and write her story because she has been hidden from history for over a century. She had 2 children and they were sent away, but all of her family members, they completely deliberately forgot about her. Descendants of her, that they'd never heard of her.
Yeah.
By the 1990s, the year 2000, some of them started to talk about her, and the others went, "What do you mean? I've never heard of this woman, and she's my great aunt." So it was
Yeah.
deliberate
Yeah.
trying to hide her from history because of the shame. And I just want
Yeah.
to find out whether she was guilty or innocent and explore that. So that will be a grim book, I have a feeling.
Yeah. Yeah. But you got to do your romance series first, haven't you? Or are you going to do
Yeah.
it? Or are you going to interlink? Yeah. Yeah. Okay.
I'll
Yeah.
probably, I'll
Makes sense.
probably, yeah, interlink them after a year. Yeah, I'll probably work on both.
Yeah.
See, my problem is because I'm farming as well. We're really busy in January, February, March, April. So I get very
Yeah.
little writing done for those 4 months. Where from now, September till Christmas, I'm not that busy on the farm. So this is when I get most of my writing done.
So, what kind of farming do you do out there? Like
Dairy,
dairy.
dairy.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
So we're spring calving. So the calves are all born in sort of mostly February and March. And then the cows go dry because they have about 8 weeks rest before the calve. So we put them
yeah.
dry the end of November, so they get a rest. And that's all we have to do then is feed them and make sure that they're healthy
Yeah.
and get ready for calving and stuff like that. But yeah, it's not as labor intensive during those months.
Yeah. I know absolutely nothing about dairy farming. So, thanks for explaining that. Okay. So, I was going to ask you about your writing. So you have very seasonal, you have this period now when you can write. Are you somebody who plots out your books, writes a plan, and then writes them in a go, or do you just kind of write up the seat of your pants, so to speak?
I write an outline. I write a kind of a fairly well, not detailed, but I'd have a paragraph for each chapter. And that doesn't mean that I necessarily stick rigorously to
Yeah.
it, but I do have an outline because I think otherwise my editing is going to be a nightmare. Yeah. And I actually have another novel in draft as well. I did it during last year during NaNoWriMo. What can often happen in farming, Tim, is that when the parents who might be, say, in their 70s, and I'd say this is pretty common in the UK as well, they want to hold on to the farm because usually their son has got married,
Yeah.
but they don't trust the daughter-in-law. They might see her as a gold
Uh,
digger, and they're
yeah.
afraid of her. They're afraid of her divorcing their husband and taking half the farm. So they hold on to the farm. So I'm writing a novel as well where we've got a young man when he's in his 40s who's single, and his father has not handed over the farm. And I'm not going to reveal which of them is in a relationship because the mother wife is dead. But yeah, it's
Yeah.
another grim novel, I'm afraid. But
Oh,
again,
well.
it's a different take on a typical situation within farming lifestyles.
Well, I don't mean you shouldn't be ashamed of your love for grim books. It's like, be out and proud that you like miserable stuff. It's like, Yeah, I don't. I think this. I have to look back at. There was one show where somebody just went through the entire show was just miserable books.
All
So
right, okay.
you're not in the point where you're going to give up farming to become like a full-time sort of diva author, or is it you would never give up farming because that's part of your lifestyle? So
Well, I'm 55 now, and I reckon my
yeah,
husband's 57, so I reckon we have about 8 to 10, definitely a max of 10 years of farming
yeah,
left in us. Either of our children want to farm, so that's another
yeah,
issue. But I think, as you get older, your reflexes slow. I'm
yeah,
definitely not as strong as I used to be. Energy levels, it's just it becomes less safe as well. But I reckon I've got about 25 years of writing left in me. So
yeah.
yeah, 10 years of farming and writing, and then another maybe 15 years of writing after that, hopefully.
Let you off for good behaviour from the
Yeah,
farming
maybe.
eventually. So are you? Once you've done, are you just going to sell the farm then?
No, that's the problem. Farmers are so attached to their land that selling
Yeah,
it, yeah, it's not something that would be happy to do. I think our daughter would like to live rurally. She just doesn't
yeah,
want a dairy farm, but she's only 20 at the moment. When I was 20, I didn't
uh-huh.
want to farm.
Yeah.
So we're just going to have to wait and see, really, in 5 or 6 years when we're getting to the stage that we're thinking, yeah, we really need to slow down, and we'll see what stage she's at then. At the moment, she's in Oslo doing an Erasmus, and I'd like to see her traveling and experiencing the world, and then we'll
Yeah.
see. We'll see later on.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you so much for being the guest this evening. It's been a very interesting selection of books. And I'm not, and like, honestly, I've seen more depressing books than what get recommended. So, and they all seem quite interesting and good reads. So, thank you.
Yeah.
And thanks there have been people watching on Amazon. They haven't said anything, but I've seen the counts on. So, thanks to the people watching on Amazon. And thanks to people who are going to watch it on YouTube and listen to it on Apple Podcasts when I get around to putting it out. It's probably tomorrow now because it's I usually do this show on Tuesdays. Yeah, the show is going to be off for a few weeks because I'm going to Southeast Asia for a while. And
Oh,
I was thinking, I could do some shows when I'm out there. And I said, no, it's going to be season 11 of the show when I come
right.
back.